Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 14 of the JFK assassination, 60 years later. In episode 13, I recommended y'all specific books and video presentations, and I left out a couple that I want to share with you now, and if any more come to mind, I'll share them with you in future episodes. The first one is an FFF book, the Future of Freedom Foundation, called Morley versus CIA. My Unfinished Investigation of the JFK Assassination. It's a great book. Jeff has been absolutely heroic when it comes to this assassination. In fact, the best website to go visit on a daily basis is called JFK Facts, and it's located over at Substack. That keeps you up to date on everything that's going on, including the still secret documents and records that the CIA insists on keeping secret on grounds of national security, if you can believe that, some 60 years after the assassination. But this book details Morley's battle against the CIA to secure the secret files of a CIA agent named George Joanides, and it's a fascinating story. The CIA has steadfastly done everything possible to keep Joanides' files top secret, classified, that no one will ever be permitted to see. And you'll see in this book the relationship that Joanides had to the JFK assassination. Great book. The other one is Best Evidence by David Lifton. Fantastic book. This is the book that actually brought up initially the fraud in the medical evidence. You see, in most murder cases, the evidence comes together in a sort of a cohesive, logical manner. You may not be able to figure out who did it, but yet the evidence is all pointing in a certain direction in most murder cases. That has never happened in the Kennedy assassination. And the reason, as Lifton observed, is that because there's fraud in the evidence. Once there's fraud in the evidence, then all the pieces are going to be jumbled up and nothing's going to come together in a logical, coherent manner because you've got fraudulent evidence in there. And so Lifton was the one that introduced that, and he also, discovered these enlisted men who were talking about having sneaked the president's body into the morgue earlier in a shipping casket. At that 6:35, you'll recall that Sergeant Boyadjian, Marine Sergeant Boyadjian, pointed out had taken place. And now, he gets some things wrong there, as Doug Horne points out in his massive 5-volume book. But Horne gives great credit to Lifton for having been a paradigm shifter in terms of the evidence. Then Horne, in my opinion, amplifies and builds in a much more effective manner what actually happened there that evening than Lifton does. But Lifton was the original paradigm builder there with respect to fraud and the evidence. And the book reads almost like a mystery novel. So it's a real page turner. So I highly recommend that. All right, let's shift over to the Abraham Zapruder film. You'll recall that in our mock trial here, the prosecutor sprung a surprise on us at the last minute. Y'all were getting ready to go back and deliberate. You'd seen all the evidence with respect to the fraudulent autopsy. In my opinion, you were ready to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. Convict the national security establishment of having conducted a fraudulent autopsy. I think clearly the evidence establishes that beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the photograph showing the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact is a fraudulent photograph because of the overwhelming evidence showing that there was a massive exit-sized hole there, in reality, in the back of President Kennedy's head. And so at the last minute, though, the prosecution, during the whole trial, just constantly saying conspiracy theory. I mean, that's always their response now. Just conspiracy theory. They never deal with the actual facts of the fraudulent autopsy. And again, recall my point is that once you establish a fraudulent autopsy, you have automatically convicted the national security establishment of the crime, of the assassination. And that's because there's no innocent explanation possible for a fraudulent autopsy. So one necessarily leads to the other. And so I was prepared to let my case go to you, the jury, because I felt the evidence showed beyond a reasonable doubt that they had committed a fraudulent autopsy and therefore had orchestrated and carried out the assassination. And then at the last minute, prosecution, after saying, conspiracy theory, all of a sudden, Your Honor, they want to introduce the Zapruder film. Okay, now what's the Zapruder film? Well, it's a film that shows the assassination. And more important, it shows the back of President Kennedy's head after the famous headshot to President Kennedy's head. It shows the back of Kennedy's head to be intact. In other words, it matches what I've been saying is the fraudulent autopsy of the fraudulent photograph. So this obviously has big implications. The prosecutor's thrown in a real fly in the ointment here, because if the Zapruder film shows the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact, and that matches the photograph, then the government's position is that, Mr. Hornberger's, all his evidence is bogus, that all these people that have said that there was a massive hole in the back of President Kennedy's head have to be wrong or independently wrong, or having entered into a conspiracy with each other to make up this false story of the back of President Kennedy's head. Remember, we're talking about Sandra Spencer, the Navy petty officer who the Jeremy Council, the general counsel for the ARRB, said was the most credible witness of all the witnesses that appeared before the ARRB. She had seen this, the photograph of the autopsy that she had developed showed this massive exit-sized hole in the back of President Kennedy's head. That matched Dr. McClellan and all the other witnesses, remember, there in Dallas as well as at Bethesda. You'll recall the long list: Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent that was looking at the back of President Kennedy's head all the way to Parkland, the nurses. Well, you'll recall all the number of people there. So the government's position is that all those people either have to be independently mistaken, or they have to have entered into a conspiracy with each other to build this bogus story. No, so there's only real two options here now that the government's left us with. If what I'm saying is true, that this was a fraudulent autopsy, this is a fraudulent photograph, that Dr. McClellan and Sandra Spencer and Nurse Bowen and all the rest of them, Clint Hill, if what they're saying is true, then it necessarily has to follow. There's no other way around it. That the photograph is bogus, but then the Zapruder film itself has to be bogus as well. And of course, what is the government's response to that? Conspiracy theory, Your Honor, conspiracy theory. So the government's going to be telling you and the judge that, now Mr. Hornberger is saying that there's a conspiracy here to orchestrate and carry out the assassination and have a bogus photograph. And there's also a conspiracy theory on the Zapruder film. That's got to be the government's position, you see. So we need to deal with this. I mean, I need to deal with this. You're the jury, and now you're starting to think, wait a minute now. Maybe you're not so prepared to convict beyond a reasonable doubt after all, because of this fly in the ointment that the government has thrown in here at the last minute. So we need to examine this. All right, so what is the Zapruder film? Well, Abraham Zapruder was a Dallas businessman. About in his 50s, he owned a store there, a dress store in Dallas, right there in Dealey Plaza. It was called Jennifer Jr.'s. The man had a very interesting background. He had grown up as a child in Russia. Very, very poor family. They were subjected to severe anti-Semitism. He never forgot that severe poverty. It just imprinted itself on his mind and his subconscious. And his family escapes to the United States, and they end up settling in New York City. And he goes into the garment business, and he finds a woman there that he falls in love with named Lillian, and they get married. And she didn't have a formal education any more than he did, but according to Abraham Zapruder's granddaughter, Alexandra Zapruder, who's written a book on the Zapruder film, that Lillian was a street smart woman. I mean, she just knew her way around, and she had keen insights into human nature. So they are in the garment business there in New York City, and suddenly Abraham Zapruder gets offered a job in Dallas, and they decide to make the move. So they go from New York City to Dallas, Texas, and they go to work for a company, I think it was called Nardis, in the garment business. And then he ultimately leaves there, and he establishes Jennifer Juniors along with a partner named Schwartz. So the nature of this business was kind of interesting. They would do knockoff dresses for women. They would go like get a dress at Neiman Marcus, very, very expensive dress, and then they would go over and copy it and make a low-cost version of that dress. And so they were very successful, catering to the less affluent sector there in Dallas and presumably maybe around the country. And they struggled at first. They lived in an area called Oak Cliff in Dallas, which is really one of the poor areas of town. But by the time the 60s come along, Zapruder has done very, very well. He's in his 50s, and he's living now in Highland Park, which has long been the area of Dallas where the most affluent people live. So on the day of the assassination, Zapruder takes his home movie camera over to Dealey Plaza. Now, if there was anybody who was a professional in an amateur sense, it would be Abraham Zapruder when it came to home movie making. I mean, this guy had been making home movies since his kids, at least since the time his kids were born. I mean, it was just his hobby, and he loved it, and he was very, very good at it. And so when he goes to Dealey Plaza to film the presidential motorcade, you're talking about not a professional, but like a professional amateur. He's got a top quality, very expensive, top of the line Kodak movie camera. And so he figures out a place there in Dealey Plaza near the grassy knolls on a pedestal up there with what is now called the grassy knoll. And he decides that he's going to film not the assassination, but the motorcade. And he deeply admired President Kennedy, and he thought this was a great opportunity to film the president, who he deeply admired as he was coming toward him on Elm Street there in Dealey Plaza. So he ends up filming the entire assassination. I mean, interestingly enough, when the shots start ringing out, there's a little bit of a shake and a little bit of a downward angle of the camera, but he keeps filming, and he captures the entire assassination. So immediately after the assassination, of course, he's in shock. I mean, like everybody else was there in Dealey Plaza. And he starts taking the film back to his office. Now, he was fortunate because other people were having their films confiscated by people saying that they were Secret Service or FBI or Dallas police and whatever. But Zapruder ends up making it back to his office and prudently locks the film up in his office safe. Soon after that, 2 Dallas policemen show up with shotguns demanding the film. They had heard that this guy had this film, and they were demanding the film, just like they were doing with other people there in Dealey Plaza. And Zapruder said no. From the very beginning when he had this film, this guy was a canny businessman. He knew he had something valuable. And he actually later told a Secret Service agent that day, Forrest Sorrells, that he intended to make a top dollar off this film. Now, you should know something about Dealey Plaza here in terms of the motorcade, that ordinarily the policy had been was to put all the professional cameramen, the photographers and so forth, in a kind of like a flatbed truck or some other kind of vehicle in front of the presidential limousine, which stands to reason because then they could be filming the president as he's coming down Elm Street or Main Street there in Dallas, and they can film him interacting with the crowd, and they can film the crowds cheering for him and so forth, because the crowds were just overwhelmingly coming down Main Street cheering for Kennedy. This time, the Secret Service ends up putting the professional photographers and camera people in the back of the, not in the far back, but further back in the motorcade, which made it so that when the assassination takes place, those professionals are not in the area. So that's why there's only like 2 or 3 films from amateurs of the assassination, and very few photographs too, and photographs are primarily those of the amateurs because of the way this photography car was placed in the motorcade. And the other thing about Dealey Plaza was that this was the end of the motorcade. From there, Kennedy was going to be zooming out to the Dallas Trade Mart for a speech, and so while the crowds were just like overwhelming when the presidential motorcade was coming down Main Street in Dallas, by the time it gets to Dealey Plaza, it's a fairly sparse crowd, which ensured again that there were fewer photographers and camera people there. So in any event, Zapruder knows he's got something of value here. And so he decides that he's not going to turn it over to the Dallas police. He doesn't trust them. He's going to he's only going to share it with the Secret Service. He had a deep sense of confidence in the federal government. So he takes his film to get developed. He first goes to a local television station where they interview him. And he says, yes, I took this film and I recorded the assassination of the president, but they tell him at the television station that they don't have the capability of developing this film, and they refer him over to Kodak. So he then heads over to Kodak, and Kodak says, well, we can develop the film, but if you want copies, you're going to have to go elsewhere for the copies. And Zapruder, in fact, wanted 3 copies made of this film. But he wanted to be very careful that there were only 3. He wanted to make sure that there were no unauthorized copies made, because obviously if there's unauthorized copies made, they're going to start proliferating, which is going to reduce the value of his film. So Kodak says, look, we can develop your film, but you're going to have to go to the Jameson Film Company to get it copied. So they go ahead and develop his film. And then Zapruder then takes the film over to the Jameson Company, and they make 3 copies. And then after those 3 copies are made, then Zapruder returns back to Kodak to develop those 3 copies. Because they just come out as copies, they need to be developed, just like the original needed to be developed. Now, there's an odd little quirk about this that is very, very important in understanding what's going on here. The film that Zapruder was using in this top quality Kodak camera was called 88 film. And what that meant was that it was actually film that was 16 millimeters wide. Okay, it was like a 25-foot strip of film, extended lengthwise, 25 feet long. And the way it would work is that you would film on one side of the strip of this 25-foot strip, and then you would open up the camera and then reverse it, feed it back in the other way, and then it would record on the other side of the strip. So you've got this long strip here, 16 millimeters wide, where you've got one side having film on it, and then you've got the other side having film on it. All right, so then what do you do then? Well, then what happens is that Kodak would then split the film or slit the film right in half, vertically, all the way down the middle. And then you would take the 2 25-foot strips now, instead of just one, you've got 2 because you've cut it down the middle, and you would connect those two strips together so that now you have a 50-foot strip that's 8 millimeters wide. So the film starts out as a 16 millimeter film, or a double 8 film, because it's going to end up as an 8 millimeter film. But they called it double 8 because it was a 16 millimeter wide, but then you'd cut it down the middle and you'd end up with an 8 millimeter film. And that's the film that Zapruder would use in his home movie camera, a projector there at home. He had an 8 millimeter movie projector, and so whenever he got his film developed in other occasions, the film would just be stripped down the middle and then he put together, and then he'd show that in his movie camera at home. Well, when Zapruder gets his original film developed there at Kodak, and they're telling him that he needs to go to Jameson, they tell him that they cannot slit the film down the middle, because if they do that, Jameson can't make copies of it. That Jameson can only make copies of a 16 millimeter film, the double 8 film, the original film. And so they tell him, let's not slit this thing down the middle yet. Go to Jameson, make your copies, bring the copies back here. We will develop those 3 copies, and then we will slit those 3 copies down the middle, and we'll slit the original down the middle, and now you'll have an 8 millimeter original and 3 8 millimeter copies. And that's in fact what happened. Now, one of the other interesting things, and you'll see why this is relevant later on, is that at Jameson, they had to determine how to make the copies of the film. And there's 2 ways you can do that. One is by bracketing. And it's sort of like, the way they fire artillery shells in a war or in a war exercise, is that they'll overshoot a target, and then they'll undershoot the target, and then they'll hit it right in the middle for effect, where they hit the target. So they overshoot it, they undershoot it, and then right in the middle. So it's called bracketing. Well, that's what they do with these films too. They'll overexpose, they'll underexpose, and then they'll hit it in the middle so that one comes out a perfect copy. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is just guess. Make your best estimated guess as to what is the right exposure to use on the copy, and just make all 3 copies that way. And that's in fact how they made the Zapruder film. They put all 3 copies exactly with the same exposure there at Jameson. All right, so they return to Kodak, and Zapruder has 3 copies, and he's got the original. Now, interestingly enough, like I indicated earlier, he was very concerned that there might be unauthorized copies. So he checked with his lawyer, and his lawyer said, look, you need to get affidavits, sworn statements from people at Kodak and at Jameson that they have not made any unauthorized copies. And so he did that. I mean, you can tell this guy's very careful, trying to protect the value of what he considers is a really big asset here. So the people at Kodak sign affidavits saying, we swear under oath that we haven't made any unauthorized copies here, only the 3 copies. And then same thing with Jameson. He made them sign affidavits there. All right, so then he gives 2 of the copies to the Secret Service. Okay, and then he takes the copy and the original back home with him. Now, this is all done on Friday, on the day of the assassination. He shows the film to his family there in his home movie projector, 8 millimeter movie projector, and suddenly he gets a telephone call. And it's from a representative of Life magazine, a man named Richard Stoley. Stoley says he wants to talk to him. He had heard about this film, and he'd like to come over and talk to him about buying the print rights to it. And Zapruder says, well, not tonight. Too much going on, too much stress, and so forth. And so he says, let's meet at my office tomorrow morning. So, sure enough, the next morning, Dick Stoley is there, representing Life magazine, meeting with Zapruder to negotiate the sale of the print rights to the Zapruder film. Now, keep in mind that that Life magazine was the most popular magazine of that time. I mean, it's incredible. It's hard to explain how popular Life magazine was. Everybody got Life magazine back then. I mean, this was a huge color magazine. I mean, they had black and white and everything, but their whole thing was color, and it was just fun to read. It was just it was like the People magazine of that time. And it was just everybody knew about Life, and like I say, it seems like everybody subscribed to it. It was the most successful weekly magazine. It was published on a weekly basis. And so when Life magazine contacts Zapruder, I mean, this is a big thing. Zapruder knew, of course, about Life magazine, and I mean, he had the utmost respect. He undoubtedly had a subscription to Life magazine. He had the utmost respect for Life, and so he knew there were going to be other people bidding, and there were other people bidding for the print rights, but he wanted to go with Life magazine. He was really hoping that they would make him a generous offer, and sure enough, they did. I mean, they outbid any of the local newspapers, which is not surprising. This was Life magazine. This is a huge operation, Time Life Inc., and so forth. So they strike a deal. Now, let me tell you about the negotiations, and this is detailed in Alexander Zapruder's book. This guy was a canny businessman. He says that he's there negotiating with Stoli, and he lets Stoli do all the offering. So Stoli says, "Okay, well, I'll offer 25 grand or 30 grand, whatever the numbers were," and Zapruder would just smile and just keep making conversation. He wouldn't come up with any counter offers, and so he just kept letting Stoli bid against himself until he reached $50,000. And at that point, Stoli says, "This is the maximum I'm authorized. This is what my bosses have authorized me to give, and it's the most I can offer you at this point without having to go back to him." And Zapruder's that hit Zapruder's point where he was ready to accept the deal, and he did. He accepted the deal. Now, $50,000 in today's terms is a lot of money for most of us, but it doesn't compare to the real value of the money back then. And what I'm referring to, of course, is the inflationary aspects of what the Federal Reserve's monetary debauchery has done over the decades. $50,000 back then was worth a lot more than $50,000 today. Back then, $50,000 was worth about $450,000. Nice chunk of change for what is essentially a 26-second film. So they end up striking a deal, but only for the print rights, not for the movie rights. You see, because this was a print publication. Life magazine had no way to show the Zapruder film as a film. That was for television or the newsreels. At the movie theaters, you go to the movie theaters and they'd have newsreels of what was going on in the world today. And so the movie theaters had the ability to do that, to show it as a film, but Life magazine didn't, and the television network certainly did also. So Life magazine was only interested in the print rights, which makes sense. So Zapruder strikes a deal for $50,000, which is the equivalent of $450,000 in today's value. And so he delivers to Stoli the original film. He retains the copy that he had. Remember, the other two copies had been given to the Secret Service. So the Zapruder film is taken from Zapruder, pursuant to this deal, and put on a plane to Chicago. And the official narrative for 50 years, well, even continuing to this day, the official narrative is that the film went from Dallas to Chicago. And why Chicago? Well, this is where Life magazine's publishing plant was. So the film was being sent to Chicago because they wanted to get it into the next issue of Life magazine. The date of Life's weekly publications was on Fridays. So an issue had come out on November 22nd, which was the date of the assassination. The next issue was going to be November 29th. They wanted to get photographs from the Zapruder film, which was in color, by the way. This was a color film. They wanted to get those those photographs into Life magazine in the November 29 issue. So the official narrative ever since has been it was flown to Chicago and then taken to the printing plant there, and then they took copies of the frames of the films and put them in the November 29th issue. Interestingly enough, they didn't use color. They used only black and white. And so the November 29th issue is filled with black and white photographs. They're kind of muddy photographs. You can't really see them too well, which is kind of strange. One explanation is they didn't have time, but it's kind of a strange explanation because that Life magazine was coming out on Tuesday or Wednesday before the official publication date of Friday. So it would seem that they could have waited several days until they had the sufficient time to produce the color, but instead they went with the black and white. And as we'll see later, there's another possible explanation for this. So we'll leave it there for this episode, and then we'll continue and examine not just the official narrative of what happened, but what actually happened to the Zapruder film. I'm Jacob Hornberger, and this is episode 14 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.